So good morning and welcome to the Michigan Co-op's October webinar. I am Lisa Sitkins and I am the facilitator of the Michigan Co-op. We would like you to please introduce yourself in the chat by sharing who you are in your school or organization and the role that you play. And also feel free to use the chat throughout the webinar to ask questions, and you can unmute your mic if you'd like to ask a question as well. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Michigan Co-op website. So it's my pleasure today to introduce the authors of the book, the Deeper Competency-Based Learning, Making Equitable, Student-Centered, Sustainable Shifts. Throughout this book, Karin and Rose and Daniel offer a guide for transitioning to student-centered learning. And as we go through the hour that we have here, if you'd like to dive deeper into a topic with the authors on a future Michigan Co-op webinar, please put that topic into the chat and I'll make note of that and we'll get them on again. So I really appreciate their willingness to share their extensive experience with competency-based education, as it's a benefit for all of us as we start move the needle further to more student-centered learning. So if you guys would like to start by introducing yourselves, and then we look forward to hearing from you.
Sure, thanks, Lisa. We've listed our websites so we can keep this part short, but there's a lot more information about our work on our websites. My name is Karin Hess. I've been a classroom teacher, school administrator. My work with competency-based work has involved multiple states, mostly in-depth in Illinois with a pilot, and New Hampshire's work. Rose?
Yeah, I'm Rose Colby. Like Karin, my experience has been as a classroom teacher at the high school level and an administrator at the middle and high school level, mostly as a principal at the middle school level within the state of New Hampshire. And I've been working in the field of competency-based education for the last 14 years or so, supporting work through the Department of Education in New Hampshire, moving their model forward, being the first in the nation group to move in that direction formally. And then also working with Two Revolutions as their competency education specialist, and working with folks in many, many states, including Michigan over the years. So I'm happy to be here today with you all. Dan?
Thank you, Rose. Good morning. My name is Dan Joseph. My experiences include high school teacher, administrator, elementary principal, working in the areas of student-centered or personalized learning, and supporting. I was part of the Maine State Task Force, so I've been working with whatever you want to call it, standards-based or proficiency-based education for over a decade. And most recently, after leaving leadership in a school district, I work for Reinventing Schools Coalition, as well as Marzano Research Associates. And my strengths and my focus throughout my whole educational career has been really student-centered design, and looking at basically how we can wrap systems around student needs for equity and agency. And currently I'm working with my own business. I've worked with a number of districts in Michigan, as well as throughout the country, just helping them with the CB design. And as interesting as it felt to me, I was using Rose's components, which we're going to talk about a little bit today, as well as Karin's tools in supporting districts in making that shift. So we're really, really excited to share this toolkit and this culmination of our experiences with you through this book, and hopefully moving forward as you guys are on your learning journey. We want to support you in any way we can. So let's, for today, I just want to kind of just get you our learning outcomes. We are going to look at those 5 components, and these are based on the new architecture of learning that Rose has kind of put out there. And I think a lot of you, if you've worked with Rose, you're very familiar with those. If you have not worked with Rose, what is it's just a systemic look on how things work. Rose will be talking about that in a little bit. We also want you to think about how you use those 5 components, and you think about your system and how you move it forward. But the end game that we want to promote is equitable opportunity, equitable access. But we're also talking about identifying where you are and moving in that direction. So we're going to focus on instruction, assessment, and grade support. We're going to scratch the surface with you today, maybe get you thinking. But the book has some identification tools associated with it. Then we want you to really think at the systemic level, the competency-based framework that we're going to present to you today through shifts and through monitored progress. We want you to leave here getting a sense as to where you are and where you may be, and how these conversations can continue and build into your school system to help move you in the right direction, working smarter, not harder, and meeting challenges. And I'm going to pass it over to Rose to talk about those 5 components.
Thanks, Dan. Really, when we look at the architecture of school, for CBE, it is quite different from traditional. And I think that's one of the pieces that we all have to look at as educators and say, where's the best place for us to start this work? You can't do it all. And some things need to be prioritized over others. But you have to go at it not from the standpoint of fixing the system that you're in to something else. You have to think of the architecture of it being different, and that it's one piece of it is also connected to another piece. And that's what really makes it the systemic piece. We've got our competencies that are, we really separate those academic competencies, consider those separately, and the path that students take through their learning based on those competencies. They are not standards. They're far bigger than standards. And we're fortunate now that with all the work that's been going on nationally, that we have lots of models for these academic competencies that we can just kind of pull in and start using to make it our own. Personal success skills are really those are the things that parents and workforce people in higher ed really identify as what we identify through our research as what really deepens the learning for students. It's you may identify those characteristics as your portrait of the graduate. The ones that seem to surface a lot are communication, effective communication, self-direction, collaboration, self-management skills. And we have to both teach and assess those. And that's one big piece that's missing in traditional education. We just kind of expect kids to be able to do that. We really have to address that very specifically within the learning tasks that we ask kids to do. In doing that, competency is all about show me what you've learned, apply it. And Karin will speak in detail about the different types of performance assessments that we look to rather than the paper and pencil end of chapter test as an indicator of learning. We need to have better ways of looking at what students have applied and what they've learned. And with that, how we gather up evidence that best communicates where the student is at in their learning along these pathways. And those learning pathways have to be individual to the students. We have created, just by virtue of the structure of traditional learning, the gaps that kids have. We let them, we don't, if a student doesn't learn something, they move forward. So we've created gaps for kids in their learning. And there's a dozen other ways in which gaps can happen with kids, but our goal is not to have gaps, is to have learning pathways that are continuous, that we continually challenge kids and develop their higher cognitive skills in their learning. And so that's what we really refer to as deeper learning when you put all these things together. And so that's what really the book is based on, and tools for each one of these as you go through and do the work. Okay, but again, your entry level is based on who you are and where you are, and also thinking through your K through 12. If your system is K through 12, you have to think of this K through 12. You just can't say, I want our elementary schools to do this. So we thought through our experience, for example, if I were to look at, working with a group, and we've all used these tools, by the way, they've gone through numbers of different iterations with teachers, with leaders. What we've really found out is that in addition to this being messy work, that you just don't look at competencies or evidence-based grading kind of siloed as a topic. There's really areas within that you have to address. All right. So for each part of the architecture, we really have assumed that we feel that you have to think it through the lens of leadership. What's the role of leadership in working with that particular area? What's the role of instruction and assessment? Where are we with this? All right. How about learner culture? That's a key piece to this. We found if kids are used to a traditional learner culture where it's teacher to student kind of top down thing, having students own their learning is a huge cultural shift in a classroom. What does that classroom look like in instruction and assessment to move learner culture more towards a self-directed learner and learner agency? And finally, your organization. It's got to change. You've got pieces of structure in your school that by virtue of moving forward or deeper in any of these, you'll have to look at very strongly and move towards changing some organizational structure. And we really see three phases of the work. These tools are designed for you to work with your staff, work with your community, and look at the focus areas and determine what phase you're best in and what might be some next steps that you can take. Okay, Dan, you want to go to the next one? Okay, and this is the first one on competencies. If you look at those focus areas, what's the role that leadership plays in looking at graduation requirements and the policies that support that? Policy is a huge issue. You can't go forward and make changes that you want to do within your school if you have policies at your school and your district level that fly in the face of what you want to do. You have to do some policy work. And so as you look at moving across, okay, we really look at what the most effective approaches that we've seen in the field, certainly starting out with a portrait of the graduate, which you see is if you have that done, you can then go into the implementation phase, working with nail down what those competencies are academically. Okay, and also the personal success skills. So this is one piece of the tool. Karen's going to explain a little bit about the assessment tool and how she uses it. But basically, we just put this in front of folks. I've had folks spend a whole half day on just this part of looking at who they are as an organization through these lenses, these focus lenses, and then come out with some steps that they can move forward in. Karin?
Sure. So I just noticed David put a comment in about the tools. What they do is they allow you to have a conversation.
Yeah.
They guide the conversation in an objective way. Where are we and where do we want to go and what are our next steps? Because we say throughout this book, there's not a way to do this. So one of the 5 tools, this is about assessment, performance assessment. And as Rose said, this is not about paper and pencil tests. If you start out with your competencies looking like checklists, then probably you're not going to be using performance assessments to check off what kids know and can do. But if you build performance assessments that integrate some of those personal success skills, like goal setting within a problem-solving task, you're starting to address this in a broader way. And so again, you may take a look and say, well, where are we? We might just be designing standards-based assessments. I say just, I know it's a big deal. I was an administrator. Moving to a standards-based report card is a big deal. But a competency-based task encompasses multiple standards, and it's easier to keep track of them when you're not looking at 30 standards, but maybe 5 to 8 competencies in a content area. And I'll pass it to Dan.
Thank you, Karin. I could not agree with you and Dave anymore. Basically, when we talk about learning pathways, I'm just going to give you my job is to give you a relevant application to this tool. When I started to work with 3 of the districts in Michigan, and they were really looking at the Marshall Plan, CBE, as well as career readiness, and this whole idea of a talent transcript. These tools, as these districts started to reflect on competencies and going forward, the learning pathway really, for me and for I think a lot of the educators who are wrestling with this, is kind of where the rubber hits the road. And that's why I chose to speak to this one. Because if you have your competencies lined up and you have your personal success skills solid, and you have assessments that give teachers feedback on where their student is in the learning, as well as the student identification of where they are in their learning, it's the pathways that really create equity of access and equity of opportunity. You have all your competencies. Now your course progressions become learning pathways. And in the CTE world, we would look at those as career ladders. So as you're building for college and career readiness, your pathway should not be necessarily driven solely by the number of courses and graduation requirements, but really looking at that success of that student for beyond graduation. So when you think about the promise of competency-based education delivering student-centered, sustainable shifts that are also equitable, it's really in the pathway design where you can ensure that student A, B, or C, whatever course of progression that they take, they're all leaving with the same core knowledge and skills that are embodied in your portrait of a graduate. And I know David's group, a year ago, David's group was really focusing in on these tools. They were a little bit different then, but I remember them spending a lot of time thinking about the learner culture and the interplay between learner culture and instruction and assessment. Great conversations. So I think that if anything, this tool helps people identify where they are and necessarily how to get where they want to go.
And all these tools are in the book, but they're also in a downloadable form for you to use. So.
Yeah, thanks, Rose. Yeah, because of time, we've shown you 3 of them, but there's one for each of the 5 core areas. This visual with the gears, you know, you've probably seen half of our slides have the gears on, because we want this to represent the interconnectedness of all of the parts. If you're only focusing on a piece, you're not going to change the system. So for example, if you decide to use performance assessments, you have to look at what are our policies around use of performance assessment. Do we calibrate with teachers? Do we provide professional learning to do it in a way that's of high quality? And what does it look like in the classroom when students are helping to shape what some of those assessments look like? So throughout this, we want to make those connections. And at the end, we'll come back to this slide. If there's an area of focus, you might want to go deeper. This kind of gives you an overview of how we see the system working together. I'll pass it to Rose.
Thanks. So the first area we'll go into with a little bit more depth. I think the 4 areas, the policy, leadership, professional culture, and professional learning, I'll speak to each of those in a minute, but we approached our work from the outset with a firm conviction and belief around competency-based education as really being the equitable educational pathways for kids. When we think of how we support these different pieces, organizational shifts, for example, with that lens of equity in all that we do, it requires us to think outside of our box, but it also forces you to think of what's part of the DNA code of your traditional system that actually is inequitable, all right? And we've lived with it and not recognized it that way. I think there's been, more and more in the last year, deeper thinking around how we've done what we've done maybe has not been the best way, okay, to support kids in their learning the way we should. So these 4 areas, policy, I won't speak too much more on that. I spoke to that earlier. Leadership, okay, that traditional top-down hierarchical leadership structure in school may not be the leadership structure that best supports where you want to go as you develop a competency-based system. So that really requires a very big change in your organization. Okay, it's going to speak to issues of collective bargaining that you may have to face. It's going to look at salary structures. It's going to look at the role that people have. Some school districts have gone to looking at what the network of responsibilities might be for any one person and recreate the job roles around leadership that includes not just the role of administrators, but also the role that parents take and the community take and that teachers take, and structuring the supports for that much differently. Professional culture, all right. We know through the COVID experience, you just can't round teachers up, put them in a room and train them up. All right. Our professional culture, I'm going to combine that with professional learning. Learning how to meet the needs of students is a learn by doing proposition. So how do we provide that learning from within, okay, based on best practices and research around these pieces? It can't be, oh, let's try this, or I've got a good idea, let's do that. We have to look at making choices around learning for kids that is most effective based on our own research about learning. And we have to ask our teachers to engage in that learning. It's action research. It's looking at what strategies would be best as we move to a change, trying it out in our classrooms, using powerful professional learning communities to do the action research and the professional learning that they need to do as you start shifting. I think moving very quickly in the COVID era in the spring caused people to pivot, not just shift. That's a difference. Shift is a number of different practices that have to change. A pivot is you stop and you have to change right away. We had to do a lot of pivoting, all right, in the spring. And I think it should open the door to a better approach to this professional learning and a professional culture that says, teachers, you're the experts. How can we support you in the learning that you need to make the decisions that you need to make in the best interest of kids? And some folks have to step out of the way, okay, in order to let our teachers do that. And really, the piece behind it is that it's to provide equity, all right? And really what equity boils down to, and all the wonderful things that have come out this last year around equity, I really kind of distill it down to a couple of key pieces in my mind. Everything that I do comes through these three venues. It's our duty as educators to ensure that each child is successful in their learning. They must be successful. And usually it falls into three different areas. One is, what's their access to their learning? All right. That access can have different barriers based on different kids. All right. What's their opportunities for their learning? And frankly, it doesn't make any difference where kids learn, but they have to have the opportunity to be in a place to learn best. All right. And finally, the pathways to success, because different kids have different barriers along the pathway K through 12. It isn't one particular thing that's a barrier or a blockage. It could be different things at different points along the pathways that we as educators who know our kids really need to understand and be aware of in order to really provide that equity for learning. And I always put the asterisk that it's whatever it takes. Okay, it isn't, yeah, you can use disaggregated data, but it's whatever it takes when you're dealing with kids on a day-to-day basis that provides that success. Okay, so that's really at the background of all the work that we do. And you have drivers that should help you make the shifts. And as you move from traditional into CBE, there's really four things that you should think about. And as you go to solving some of the barriers that get in your way, use these four things. How am I going to use time differently to solve it? How am I going to use my talent differently? I'll come back to talent in a second. How am I going to use my technology differently? We've gotten a good handle on that in these last couple months. And how am I going to use my resources differently? Time is something which we found out, for example, I don't know if you found that out, but if you just take face-to-face time schedules in your school and put it into online learning, it doesn't work. Well, how are you going to change time differently? How do you create bigger blocks of times in which teachers work with kids? Talent. Very difficult unless you've looked at how you group kids differently, how you approach curriculum in a span rather than at a grade level, so that kids can be grouped across a span, how you employ your professional talent, your resources in working with kids at these different academic groupings that you have. I'm not saying grade levels, I'm saying academic groupings. What technology is there to support teachers as well as kids, and the resources that you need. Resources have to be a little bit different if you're doing remote learning. You're going to use for example, your special education staff differently, your text resources. All of these things have to be looked at using a different lens. But if you always come back to those four things to solve your problem, you'll be on the road to solving your problems. Okay, so go ahead to the next one, Dan. So I'm going to just have you take just a couple minutes, 2 minutes, all right? With what we've presented so far around the architecture and some of the pieces of the shifts, the three main shifts that you have, do you see a logical entry point for yourselves to address your systemic shifts to CBE? Or if you have already are in the middle of that, do you see anything that we've raised today that you can take further into your development work? So why don't you go ahead and just take a couple of minutes, think about that, and add your thoughts to the chat. Hey, Karen, you want to take over?
Sure. I'd love to take
Get
over.
our thoughts together. And
Dan, next slide.
I was reading the chat. I'm sorry.
yeah, I am too.
We have to keep Dan on track, you know.
Oh, seriously. Well, I thought we were going to respond to those because there's a common
now you
thread.
Yeah.
That's what I was getting ready to do.
All right, go
Okay.
ahead, Dan.
Well, I think starting with David's comments, what I feel through these comments is the change in mindset, the concept of access, and the concept of engagement. And I think those three forces, I think they come to a point where we have to look at the role and the responsibility of the teacher, the student, and what exactly is learning. When a student is sitting face to face with you, you can enter into a codependent relationship where you're mindful of them not being attentive and pulling them back into place. Where we want to have a situation where you have disassociated through asynchronous, synchronous, distance learning, we're relying on that student to have self-monitoring, self-correction.
Yeah.
We're also imploring our teachers to make learning rigorous, which is just right, as well as relevant, so it's engaging. So I think what COVID has done is just pulled back this curtain on what's the difference between teaching and learning. To cover something and to teach something is not always the same as promoting an opportunity for learning. So it's really that opportunity and access to learn that I think is the conversation. And then you think about the value of learning through our practices. Grading is do this or I will hurt you. Or there's this bigger understanding of the leadership and these policy forces is, do I want to hold a kid accountable for something that I don't even know I firmly believe in is best practice or education? So do we want to harm the kids? I heard that a lot in a lot of the districts I work with. So you're absolutely right that there are threads there. And I think Karen's going to speak to a little bit about assessment, feedback, and pacing. I'll talk a little bit about building that student-centered culture. But it just brings back, there's so many different ways to look at this problem, but what's unique to you and what's the problem you're trying to solve? And I think those tools can help you do that. And hopefully the book will provide you with some solutions.
I just want to quickly address Steve's comment. If you can think of raising your curriculum up out of grade level, all right, into a chunks of curriculum, grades 3 through 5, for example. All right. You don't have to worry about the role of the 4th grade teacher. You have to think of how you're going to use your professional staff differently. The 4th grader is going to be a 4th grader developmentally and socially. Okay. How they move through their academic learning isn't chronological. It can go fast, it can go slow. Okay, they may already know something when they hit a piece of curriculum. So if you raise your curriculum up out of grade level and you use formative assessment to create groups of kids, you deploy your professional staff around meeting the needs of different groups of kids. All right. And some districts have gone through those types of changes, but don't think conventionally about what's the language arts teacher in grade 4 going to teach. Okay, you have to group kids differently and deploy your professional staff differently. Karin, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm really interested in the comments in the chat. I'll try to respond to a couple on these next slides.
Stay focused,
So,
Karin.
Focus. So the second focus area we take on is teaching and learning shifts. And one comment was the idea of assessment and grading are so difficult for many teachers to shift to because they want to mark it right or wrong, have a percent. And what we talk about is the need for incorporating both academic competencies and personal skills, building high quality performance assessments, and using the evidence from those to determine the grading. So if you're still using percents, when I was teaching, I was using percents. When kids handed in things late, I knocked them down. I did all of the things that were done to me. And it's taken a long time to shift that thinking. But if you start to create academic competencies of deeper learning and incorporate these skills, then creating the performance task, and we walk you through how to integrate these two things into high quality tasks so that now you're looking at grading and reporting as a continuum of the kinds of tasks kids are doing, and you're not averaging. So let's go to the next one. So this is the idea, and I noticed another comment, it's so hard. Okay, I taught many different grade levels, and just because I was teaching 6th grade or 8th grade didn't mean that everybody in my class was at the 6th grade or the 8th grade level. I moved from 3rd grade to teaching 8th grade. I had a lot of kids who weren't reading on an 8th grade level. The advantage I had is I knew how to teach reading on a 3rd grade level. So if we think of the curriculum as a continuum and we really use formative assessment to find out where you are, we stop seeing learners in a deficit model. We see them as on a progression, and we can only help them if we're not trying to jump over maybe some of the foundational skills they need and have expectations they don't have anything to build on. So that's the first maybe different way to view curriculum. If you build it as a continuum and you get rid of a lot of repetitiveness, you can find out where kids are within a grade span. And then next slide. And then what we talk about is build assessments along a continuum so that you have short cycle within the lesson, the learning targets that tell you if kids are ready to move on. Then we go from there to building maybe more structured, shorter performance tasks. And if teachers have never done performance tasks, this is maybe where they need to be focusing on, not on project-based learning or problem-based learning or capstone projects at first. But if you're going to go to some of those higher, deeper levels, you have to think of the continuum. And what we call a performance scale is you build assessments along that scale. And so if students are performing at some particular level of that scale, that's going to be influence the grade they get, as opposed to averaging the short cycle formative task with some performance tasks with some other reflective essays that they're writing. So we try to pull that all apart. This is huge, but if you build good assessments, it informs evidence-based grading. And then the next slide. So the big picture is we're building a body of evidence, but you notice the body of evidence, part of that pyramid is small, so it's selective. So we start with the daily learning targets. Dan, click. Those are parts of competency. So we don't ask them to do everything. We ask them to do parts of it. Did a webinar yesterday on self-direction skills. So there's a lot of components to self-direction. Some of it is about goal setting. Some of it is about self-awareness. You teach parts of it, and then you move from those parts to start to put them together with more of a summative approach. In the summative assessments, we are combining some competencies. Maybe those are the school-wide profile the graduate competencies. You use multiple formats. This is about access and opportunity. Kids don't have to do all the same assessment. This is a shift for some teachers, but a student's self-reflection as part of a summative assessment, what did you learn? How do you know you learned it, is very powerful. And it doesn't get graded the way traditional assessments get graded. And then what bubbles up to the top and through committee is what is the body of evidence we want students to have in their maybe digital portfolio that really shows evidence of learning. And so you have conversations, cross-curricular conversations. You have decisions that are made, and everything that was in the bottom doesn't bubble up to the top, but some assessment evidence will be very powerful, and it will tell you where kids typically are performing throughout maybe a quarter or a semester. So just talking about how do we make rules for a body of evidence is a huge piece of the school-wide, the district-wide conversation. Next slide. So if there's anything that I said, we know what some of the challenges are, but in this section on shifts in assessment and grading, please feel free to put those in the chat now. We'll try to respond to a few of them, and then Dan will finish the last section. So we'll give you, again, about 2 minutes, and we'll take a look at, but there's a lot of chat going on.
There's actually some really good questions there for you, Karin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why would superintendents or local leaders take such a huge risk to try and move their entire community down this path? Karin.
Well, I would say this, having been an administrator, you can't do it all. So you take a piece that you can pilot and refine and do a good job on. In the self-direction work that I've been doing, we built rubrics. We have a group of teachers actually across multiple school districts who are piloting those tools and refining them. And now their school, they're rolling it out to their faculties this year, whether they're remote or a hybrid model or in school. So you have to look at it as what's a long range plan. Why would a superintendent want to do this? I think the most powerful argument for shifting is to show parents what students are able to do that they never could have done before in the old system. The projects, the involvement, the student-led projects. We're hearing about stuff on the news where kids are deciding they have to get out there and maybe register voters in their town because they've taken on that as a task.
I think also too, I think that isn't this the contract that we make with our community? That when they create that portrait of the graduate, that you have a graduate emerging with all of the skills necessary to be successful as they enter into the workplace in their careers or into higher education. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process of deepening the learning as they go through and demonstrating their learning. So it can't be isolated to just high school. This has got to be systemic and work all the way through the system. But that's our contract as educators with our community. That's what we say we're going to do, right? We're just saying this is how you do it. Okay.
I'd like to just comment on one other one, and then Dan, I want you to move us along. But assessment in the remote setting. One of the things we try to stress is if you build a performance scale of different assessments, it says, show me you can do this, then you're ready to move on. It increases the engagement. Mm-hmm. We've had teachers we've worked with who will say, we have some time where we bring the class together online, but then we have what we call office hours. And office hours might be, it's a phone conversation I'm going to have with an individual student, or we're going to get online together depending on the age of the student. But we're going to say, what did you do? What did you struggle with? So that's how we've heard a lot of teachers trying to address this. And you don't move on to those complex tasks before you're ready. And then what we build, we suggest building in, and we've got examples of it in the book, where students are maybe using Flipgrid to give each other feedback or to work together, or they're using Google Slides where everybody in the class has a slide that's theirs. They react to something, and then part of the assignment is you have to react to 5 other students in what they're proposing. So there are ways to use technology on a smaller scale to create that involvement and moving them up the performance scale. And I'll pass it to Dan.
Lots of questions in the chat. We could probably do a whole webinar just on that one focal point. The one bow I want to put on, and the reason I'm friends with Karin right now, we chose to write this book together, is Karin really opens up the conversation to changing the metric on how we assess or how we collect bodies of evidence. And I think starting there, you really start to see the importance and the interplay between the academic and the personal success skills, which is kind of the lead into this last focus section. The last thing I want to say is the state of Maine with the Southern Maine Partnership, they went out and they got all the colleges to sign onto these varying transcripts. That's one small piece of that pie. We had 1422, which was legislation saying that you need to have a standards-based diploma. That has been defeated because we never got down to the instruction. We never got down to the changing of the mindsets. We never had conversations around the life that our kids are being put into is very different than the life that you were taught in and the job you may currently have. So all of this comes back into chapter 3 in the book, helps, I think, you to have those conversations with your staff as well as with your community. So having said that, and I think this is the last section here, and it's basically student-centered classroom shifts. And I'm thinking about the chat, core instruction, what's important? How do we know what's important? We can't teach all standards, but we need to measure those that are important. It kind of goes back to how does your portrait graduate living and breathing in a classroom? I've done student conversations where they honestly think the competency is the assessment. The competency is the test. There's a disconnect there. Thinking about pace. A lot of people have talked about time. Pace and time are pretty much the same as long as you understand where a student is in relationship to where they need to be and what that instructional pace is, because time is a variable. Where is the student in relationship to where they need to be is what sets their pace. Assessment and feedback, student-centered learning. Perfect example is if you have grade level pathways. Manchester, one of the elementary schools I work with in Manchester, we had grade level pathways for math and ELA. We had PLCs, we had conversion assessment, we had excellent conversations. We knew COVID disruption. There were kids in 2nd grade who missed the last trimester. There's no way these kids were ready to go to 3rd grade. So we took our 2 pathways, our progressions, combined them, and we made multi-age classrooms. We did it out of necessity. It wasn't something we said, hey, let's try this. They said, well, maybe we need to put these 2 together and put students together. That is where your system, your pathways and your progressions and your understanding of learning and where kids are in their learning brings you into a systemic change. Student supports equity, body of evidence, and culture. Really what I want to kind of just focus in on one aspect of this is really assessment and feedback that promotes engagement. Just so you know, throughout the book, as we're giving you tools or practices or thoughts, we continue to bring them back to Hattie's influencers. And they're all the high leverage influencers. So throughout the book, the book itself embodies really that visible learning or that student understanding where they are in their learning and the teacher understanding what it is they want the student to understand in terms of success criteria. So that goes throughout the book. When I think about engagement, equity, and mastery, we talk about goals and strategies all the time. If the goal for the student is to find success, there are strategies that live in 4 different compartments. There are cognitive strategies, which is really looking at the skill and looking at the rigor and making sure that you're giving them just right work. And we're clear about what we want them to do with the information, not just give it back to us. metacognitive strategies really activate the self system as well, which promote engagement. We want students to think about their thinking. We don't want them to rely on us to tell them they are right or wrong at the conclusion of learning, because we know error correction deepens understanding and promotes engagement and ownership on the part of the learner. Motivational strategies, that's my dog, motivational strategies in terms of self-efficacy and self-regulation. Think about the reality we're confronted with right now. And I have had teachers say they want, even doing workshops in a classroom, elementary teachers feel like the only time that they want to have substantive instruction is when they have that kid right there. Or they want to do a lot of whole group instruction because they're putting out the information and they can read it back. What does it look like, or what do students need in order to be in charge of their own learning? I'm talking kindergartners through 12th grade, and that requires a teacher to let go. But in order to let go, they need to teach, monitor, and measure those personal success skills that we talk about as one of those components within each student. Then obviously there's management strategies, which is basically promoting ownership, leadership, and responsibility on the part of our students. So if you think about, I want you to be an independent learner as our goal, there are strategies that really need to be imparted, taught, monitored, measured, and given feedback on. So these are conversations we probably should be having, or could be having right now, as we talk about the COVID disruption and the reality of instruction right now. The big picture of visible learning for us, or for me, is really, and this is where assessment turns into, you have that progression and you have assessments that go along the progression, which is what Karin was talking about. But really, if you just keep that teacher facing, we're missing a huge opportunity. We want to make that student facing so that the student can repeatedly identify where, I know where I'm going. They know what the target is. They know the tools for the journey. I know how to move myself along that progression. I know where I am in that progression. So now you can start to see it's teacher pace or better. Students can go ahead of you, or you will know if they're off pace, or they will know if they're off pace. Now grades kind of take a step back and really, are you on pace with your learning? And what's your evidence that you are on pace? Not, hey, next week, Wednesday, I'm going to give you a quiz. And then I can recognize when I'm ready for what's next. That's that self-reflection. And all of these really are these student learning strategies. If you look at a lot of these, 0.4 or greater is considered value added. It's something a teacher should invest time in using and implementing into their instruction. And you'll see that most of these have a real high return rate for that practice. And then it all comes together with assessment capable visible learners. Personalized instruction is like a 0.28, but assessment capable visible learners is a 0.73. And the most important tool teachers have is really the tool for feedback. And feedback happens on 4 levels. The task level, which is basically the one that we use most frequently, and it's corrective feedback. The process level is one that is feedback that promotes metacognition. Don't just give them the answer, help them find the answer, help them rethink the core mathematical practice that they may need to revisit and learn to move forward. The self-regulation is really understanding, it goes back to what we talked about. Where am I in relationship to where I need to be? Oh, I'm off pace. Oh, I need to be an independent learner. And then they activate those strategies for themselves. And then self level is really making sure that they understand the value of what they're doing. And this is the one I think teachers, when you think of growth mindset feedback, this is the one that I think kind of raises to the top to them. You're not supposed to say great job, you're supposed to give feedback on the process. So make sure your praise is giving them a celebration, but not on the outcome, but necessarily along that continuum of the process of learning. And I think that see, I'm always, so all of these come together to really build. We talk about, I always say, what's the most plentiful resource in our schools? It's our students. And these are tools that help us activate them and look at them as a resource that can be leveraged, for lack of a better term, or activated so that they own their own learning. So we're asking you, what are the greatest challenges and opportunities for your school to address these type of shifts in creating those personalized pathways for learning?
Lots of comments in the chat area
Always
there,
gonna jump on
Dan, so
those.
take a
Yeah.
chance to look
Well,
at it.
go ahead. If you want to just give one or grab one, that's
I think
fine.
there seems to be an interest in, who are the other folks who've been doing this work? And I can say, and probably Dave, Dave Richards, if you want to pipe in on this, you've got a good lens into what's happening in a number of different places. But I think it's been my experience. I've re-engaged with a lot of schools who I've been working with for a number of years to kind of fine tune what they were doing as they moved into their COVID responses and restructuring for those purposes. And the best I can say is they've been, they haven't had the difficulties that many of the other traditional systems have had going into the COVID times, and mainly because they generally have clarified their competencies. The kids have been working with the competencies right along. They aren't doing a lot of direct instruction and worksheet work. They're doing, more on the order of performance assessment. Teachers are organizing kids in working groups digitally, and they're using larger blocks of time in which kids have to work just like they do in their classrooms in those CBE structures. So they were able to make that transition over to, a 100% digital or hybrid setting, so that it didn't really make any difference where the kids were doing their learning. They were doing it the same way as they did when they were, in going to school kind of a pre-COVID time. So we do have lots of models out there. Aurora Institute has been really good about posting those systems that are doing that and sharing it out. I know I've been really impressed with some work out of Illinois, Minnesota, North Dakota. New Hampshire's got some good models because we've been doing it for so long. Lindsay Unified, I know, Dan, you probably know some folks in Maine, and Karin, some folks in Vermont who've been able to make that transition really well, because they were doing what they needed to do pre-COVID, and they just pulled it in. So.
Yeah, Rosa, I would just add, I think in Michigan, and Steve and Phoebe are here from the MDE, it has been a focus for us for several years.
Yep.
The challenge has been really trying to get it off the ground in regards to a statewide initiative. Building capacity with our leaders, those folks that are a little more risk averse of diving into something like this, because it's a significant systemic shift when you do it right. And so our competency consortium, we're starting to build a relationship with Carolyn Eastman and the team over at NHLI. Start, best practices, meeting together. What are you guys working on? Here's what we're working on. But it's one where we need, and I'm glad to have been here today as well. We need to have that statewide conversation consistently. And I think that we're very close to that. I believe the Department of Ed has always kept this on the burner, if not at the front burner, but it's been there. We just need to really structure it and say, listen, we're committed to trying to design new models of learning for kids in Michigan. And so I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful that we're going to make strong progress. I think the turnout today speaks to that as well. And so excited about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you're working with NHLI. That's the New Hampshire Learning Initiative. And they really are the group of folks that have been doing this work for almost 15 years now. They were the pioneers in the New Hampshire move towards CBE. And they, and together with Paul Leather and his group at CIE, Paul was our deputy commissioner in New Hampshire. So that's a great alliance for you guys to make. And I know you're going to move the work forward, using them.
So we're going to sort of end with this, coming back to this slide. I think you've generated some possible topics. I think GPA and a shift from a number to to something more meaningful, it is a good one to delve into maybe in the future. We're just sort of offering these as possible topics. And I'll also mention, because of my work with the New Hampshire Learning Initiative, we just did a presentation yesterday at the Aurora Institute. The PowerPoint is posted on my website where it says archives, on student self-direction. So a lot of things that Dan was talking about, this pilot group of teachers from middle and high school have been piloting not only the rubrics, the research-based rubrics that we develop, but also classroom tools where kids are reflecting on their learning, collecting that. It will soon be available as a self-direction toolkit, probably in about 2 weeks. But if you're interested in just good tools, good solid tools that have been tried in classrooms, that might be a resource. But we invite you to, we've written the book so you could self-facilitate these discussions in your districts. And we'll just kind of open that up to anything you might want to pursue further down the road. Online approaches as well as in-class, in-person approaches. And you guys are awesome.
Yeah,
I love
absolutely.
your questions are so thoughtful. Your comments are great. Like I'm falling in love with you from a distance. It's like speed dating, and I'm in love with all of you.
This is definitely the group of movers and shakers in Michigan who are forward.
I can see that.
So it's great to get them together. So if you think in the future, if there's a day or two later, you're like, oh, that would be a great topic to have the authors come back, let me know. Like Karin said, the GPA topic is a possible one, but I'm happy to, send me an email because I'm sure I'll be following up with Karin and Rose and Dan about a future topic webinar. So,
right, and Dan just put, we've created a website that sort of parallels the use of the book, and he just put that in the chat. So you might want to check that out as well. We've tried to pull some pieces from the book that you might want to use locally.
And more importantly, David put the link to the book.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I don't mind a good plug here.
Thank you, David. The check is in the mail.
Of course, you have to really be cool to get a signed copy, which,
Woo!
I don't want to say anything.
Okay.
Try to pick the airport.
Dave and I go back a long time. So
I guess Rose loves a few people in this group too.
Yeah, I do. I've really enjoyed working with Michigan folks. So
we need
Lisa, one thing, would it be helpful to make the recording, but also the presentation available to folks that were on today?
Yes.
I'm happy to have them use that. So
I'm going to post the recording, the slideshow that Dan has, the links to the resources, which is what Dan just shared, and then a link to the book as well. I'll put all of it when I post the video. Yeah.
And don't hesitate to contact us with anything. Like, you folks are really, really busy. And don't just if you need something from us, just email us. I share myself and all my work that I've done openly, and whatever I can do to help support your work with any resource that I have, I'm happy to send it along to you, or to have a conversation. I hate to say a Zoom meeting because we're Zoomed out, but happy to help in any way that's going to support your work.
Thank you. I appreciate all three of you being on to share your expertise, and thank you for everyone who participated and all the great questions in the chat. I mean, this has been an awesome webinar. So we really appreciate that. I just have two things I wanted to mention. The question we talked about, why doing competency-based, and the question can go deeper than that, is just why do we do education? What is our why in education? So the Michigan Co-op is doing a book club on Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. And that's a monthly conversation that we have, and you can get more information on mi-coop.com website. And for those of you who are on that are Michigan Co-op members, next month we are having a webinar with Westminster Public Schools. And I know Lindsay has been mentioned numerous times in this conversation, but Westminster Public Schools also started about the same time as Lindsay. So they're in their second decade of doing CBE, and we'll be talking with Oliver Granham from there next month. So I'll be sending you an email about that. But thank you all so much for being on, and we look forward to more conversations like this.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Lisa. Thanks, everyone.